Hello, everyone, and welcome to the ABA Midseason Review. Today, we're going to be going over the current standings in the ABA, and we'll be taking a look at who we think might be contending. But first, we have some really awesome breaking news. So, there's been a trade to announce. The trade is the Steve Rice trade, in which um, the Kings trade the massive contract of James Onwudiegwu and Rickien Hicks, along with two picks, one from Seattle, and two from KC. That's three picks, my bad, for Steve Hotsaki Rice, who had a massive contract he had just signed. Now the Kansas City Kings have a pretty solid roster featuring Hotsaki as their new superstar. He was fairly disappointing with San Diego across 4.5 years, averaging just 17-7. However, he had proved briefly to be a true superstar that could lead them to contention, but unfortunately they didn't quite make the a deep playoff run that he was looking for, and the team faltered. And with bad progressions from him and Brent Jones, just didn't look like they were going to go anywhere. So they had to make the tough decision to move on from him and to begin the rebuilding process. It's going to be interesting to see how manager Jay Datio takes it. Now, James Onwudiegwu has been traded to three teams since signing a 7-year, $23 million deal with Cincy. This is an example of an albatross contract holding negative value in the league, as his contract has actively been traded for first-round picks in prior moves. In this case, is being traded as a positive, as his contract expires next season. It'll be interesting to see what happens with him and if he earns a significant role on a rebuilding San Diego team alongside Brent Jones. Now let's take a look at the actual standings of the league. So here you'll see that Miami leads the East. They're having a breakout season, thanks in large part to Jay Kumar and McPherson Thompson, who have become a real 1-2 punch on their starting lineup. However, it is worth noting they might be one of the deepest teams in the league and have a ridiculous, I believe, 4 players with 75 plus potential, 5 players with 75 plus potential. This team, the sky's the limit. They have, I think, 4 creative players as well, if you count True Young. Um, they former co-GMs of the year. I mean, this team is stacked for a long time and can be one of the best teams in the league. It's going to be interesting to see how great they can be if they can keep this young core together. But of course, the salary cap, that can always be difficult. In addition, you have Chicago back now up in the running. As I said, the Jet Stevens move was a huge move, a great move by Fleecer. He's proving to be the absolute star he was in Vancouver, and they just an absolutely great move. Julius King's breaking out to become a real star, and Extract seems to be a lot more committed than Zeke was to making this team a winner. And overall, I think that as long as they add depth before the playoffs, they could be making another late run here, and Fleecer might be looking at GM of the year potentially. Washington, they're a truly special team. Josh Wade is going to be their franchise player for a decade. Trustis is an absolute beast, and Cagle was a nice addition. He's been playing pretty solid for them. It's going to be interesting to see how they develop as a roster, as they're all fairly young and have some more years to gel. But they could definitely be a conference final contender for the next decade. Also, nice to see Forrest Morris playing well off the bench. He's had a pretty interesting career. If you followed him back when he was an absolute bust in college. Um, Now we'll move along to Kentucky, one of the most exciting young teams. Billy Bogue's probably an MVP candidate here. And with him, Karl Anthony Towns both having great seasons. It's a little disappointing seeing Billy's numbers go down after being so high in Montreal, but Karl Anthony Towns working alongside him is a great pairing long term, and it's awesome seeing Nobby with his legend player, and even Jaden's playing well. Now we're going to take a look at next team. Okay, so now we'll take a look at the next team, which is going to be Detroit. Detroit here has Jacob Anura, who walking triple double, but he might honestly be on his way out. The team is in the running, but they're not really a top tier team, and their GM's a little trigger happy, so it's going to be interesting to see. But with great defensive play from a potential future defensive player of the year in Thunderbird, who's looking pretty much like an Austin Robinson Slamtown clone. It's a really weird dynamic they got going on there, but Julian Clarkson might be a very volatile player. He's a cap of Cleve who constantly leaves the server. So it'll be interesting to see what they do with that. But overall, I have a lot of faith in this team. I think they have their first active GM in a while. I'll be good to see how they do. We'll take a look at Atlanta. Atlanta's got a ton of really good forwards, but really struggles when it comes to finding a elite guard and an elite center. As of right now, they have Julian Gordon, who's kind of a career bust, so to speak, running the big man position. Deion Brown's playing some minutes there, and he's really just a rebounding specialist. And at point guard, they have the quote-unquote washed-up Willie Nelson, who's having a pretty solid season, proving that he's a very valuable person for a contender. But they don't really have any true star power, so they're probably looking at a first or second round exit here. Looking at New Jersey, they're just having a disappointing season across the board. Their GM's got to be wondering what's going on. Hughes is really struggling. He honestly might be on the block soon. I know he has a no trade clause, but they're not as big a contender as you'd hope for coming off a championship year. And with some tough expiring contracts, like what's Morris's actual worth? Is Morris going to get a $20+ million deal? Is he worth that? Can they even afford that? And I think MGF is coming up too, and yeah, they're going to have to make some decisions with this New Jersey squad. Now, if we take a look at Toronto, Toronto is an interesting story. If they just can stay healthy, and if they can add a real true third superstar, and try to keep Bugs and Clark on their starting lineup as well, this could be a really good team. Noah Childs and Donovan Butler are 1-2 punch with a long-term signed contract. This team has a lot of positives, upsides, and could really go the distance for a long time here with two really solid MVP candidates locked in together for almost a decade. Cincinnati's got to be disappointed with where they're located right now in the standings, but they have a lot of young talent, and I definitely see them moving up. They could definitely bump one of the teams above them. Most likely, they're going to bump Atlanta or New Jersey, maybe Detroit if they decide to blow things up, and Chicago, you don't know yet. But Cincinnati deserves to be in the playoffs. They're way playoff caliber roster. So a very competitive Eastern Conference. Diedrich's having a great season. Shaheen's having an even better year. Shaheen might even be a borderline MVP along with Halenga, who is probably the MVP of the league if they can get into the playoffs. Um, it's going to be really interesting to see how Dante Cook, who is a big part in the Terrence Foster deal, pans out. Dante Cook's a scoring forward. He's replacing a playmaker, but he'll have less of an opportunity here, and he wasn't putting up particular big stats, but it'll be interesting to see how that works out. Cleveland's probably the biggest disappointment in the league. They should be a contending team, and they're not. You got to wonder, is George Moss going to get tired of losing? Could Black Jesus demand a trade? And frankly, is Moda going to blow this roster up again? I mean, they're supposed to have a franchise big, but he isn't living up to the potential. Next year is entering his make or break. It's going to be a really interesting story to see if he decides to make a decision to move away from him. And it's nice to see Igor Moda being on Moda's team, but he's just not doing anything. All right. New York is actually having a surprisingly solid season. If Unsled didn't go down with an injury and they didn't get hit constantly by injuries, this would probably be a playoff team. It's not a disaster. It's not bad to watch. It's just a team that needs a star. And once they find one, whether it be in free agency or the draft, they're probably going to go places. Yeah. Next up, we have Montreal. Montreal just lost GM at Damien, but they've made the move to pull in David Karishnow. Hopefully I pronounced that right. But with injuries to Colin Thompson and Tamaj Smith and disappointing progs and even a hard free agency, his team is not in a particularly great spot right now. And it's going to need some work, most likely moving on from Colin Thompson, who's by far their best player. Potentially losing some of their bench as well. It's good to see that Chase Powers is finally playing after being one of really the biggest busts in league history. So it'll be nice to see how that develops. Looking out the bottom of the Eastern Conference, we have Boston, which again they're led by a bunch of point guards. That's about it. Chris Bosh is having a great season, but they're too small. They can't really contend in this type of league. But Francisco Castori has become a real true star and a potential long-term all-star and franchise player for the Boston team on a nice long contract. So I think that they'll benefit from that. Um, Carolina is they're an aging roster. Only good news is that one of their former players' sons is in the draft. We'll see how that plans out for them. But they're in a hard rebuilding mode here. That's really all I gotta say on Carolina. At least they paid their stars. Baltimore, they're basically Carolina, but without focus or a ring. Um, Marcus Buckner is putting up monster stats, but he does that everywhere. He's probably got to move. They have 360 pluses, 364 actually, and they are likely not even a playoff team. They need to add so much depth to this roster to be able to contend, but it's not unreasonable for them to do it. Um, they just honestly need to be focused, and GM 3's 2 needs to get on this and put his mind towards building his team into the contender that very clearly was positioned to by GM Jerry. And the last team we'll take a look on East here is, yeah, the Carmelo Anthony-led Pittsburgh Condors. He's averaging 17 points per game. That's the best thing about this team. Yeah. Colin Rollerson's averaging 17 rebounds a game. Yeah, they're not an efficient team. They're really struggling with identity. It's just, you got to tank sometimes, I suppose. And they are tanking. In the West, we have the likely contender of Anaheim. They're almost always a contender here. Basically, if you see them up in the standings, they're probably going to be contending. They made some nice additions, adding some depth for another playoff run. They're going for that second ring, and with Max Powers, Byron Powers, and Hassan Green, they probably got a real chance there. Fleecer's also having a really solid season off the bench, or actually, I think he's their starting shooting guard. My bad on that. They're probably going to go places, and I'd have to say that GM Hugh is probably looking at a potential GM of the Year nod for his team's continued success and potential hunt for number 2. Anaheim's one of the best teams in the league. They continuously are. Not much else to be said there. Speaking of consistency, you got Dallas. Dallas has been consistent and always aging for the last 6 seasons. They are now aged to the point where they're at the end of the line, but somehow they drew the lottery and got a borderline all-star in David West in the draft. And now they have some hope. It's funny that their young guys are 27, 26, but this might be their last dance, and we'll hope that they can take it. All-star and former MVP candidate Logan Sterner and ISO Joe both are a solid two-way duo, but they just don't really have a true superstar on a roster of a lot of solid role players. So Milwaukee has an MVP season from Ty Jackson, which is absolutely insane to say for the once defensive specialist. He's completely transitioned into a two-way superstar, and frankly, this team is built around him. As much as they have other players, it's him and A.O. McKinney are a 1-2 punch, and everyone else is just kind of there doing their thing. A.O. McKinney is also a great two-way star. I mean, the two of them are a great pairing. They just need a really great playmaker around them. If they were to add, say, Tyrone Petrie off of St. Louis, or had they landed Hatsaki Rice, they could be looking at a true big three. But I think all they need really is a point guard, and they'd be unstoppable. And with just a few more teams to go, we'll take a look at Utah. Somehow, they always fail to hit expectations. McPherson's having a solid season, but it's a little disappointing after his unprecedented year. Abbott never really took that superstar leap, but it's been really solid. Having LeBron James on their roster to go along with McPherson is a crazy amount of balance. But this team is just so unbelievably deep, but also so underperforming expectations. And Dallas Moore averaging single digits just speaks to their depth and, frankly, their lack of expectations here. I mean, the team had so much upside and has just really squandered a lot of it. Len Bias is looking more and more like a bust each day, and it seems that while JJ did nail the LeBron lottery, he might not have necessarily had a lot of his draft picks from that pool be hits. I mean, this team without a ring, despite constantly having high first-round picks after great seasons. So it's going to be interesting to see what he does in the upcoming year. And if we look to the next team, it's actually Denver. They were in the finals last year. They're only a game back. That's how thick the West's top side is. One game between seeds 1 and 5. Denver is a deep team, probably the deepest and best defensive team in the league. They have so many shutdown players. I mean, David Jackson, Taryn Hasbro, Cyphers Moore, Didi Savage, Corona Avaris. Carlton Anderson even was a great defensive player just a few seasons ago. And Brian Weber is one of the most underrated superstars in the league. So this is a solid team. It's going to be interesting to see how Hawthorne fits onto this roster. But they also are linked to Allen Johnson, who's another great defender who was just cut by Milwaukee. So it's going to be interesting to see if Denver can repeat their success. They definitely are a herd mentality team. I mean, it's a team that's very deep and has a lot of quality off the bench the other teams just don't have to match. So we'll take a look now at the next roster, which is Vancouver. Only 2 games back and in the 6th seed. John Money Banks is carrying this franchise. Yes, he is worth the $30 million, but better yet, Dedrick Vonville and Sam Eustace are a great 2 and 3 for him. The team's got absolute amazing chemistry. I mean, got guys like Steve Miles putting up huge numbers once again in a contract year and a great season for him. It's going to be interesting to see what happens with the expansion draft. Rumor is in an interview, I Love Waffles admitted that Oliver Nuzelli was actually meant for the expansion draft, meaning that he's basically a salary cap filler. And I think that was a great decision because Nuzelli is not a bad contract for a team that wants a young center to be part of their depth, but he isn't really a superstar either that you necessarily want on your roster for $20 million. So it's going to be interesting to see if he gets drafted high in the expansion or if he even goes in the expansion. Now we'll take another look. And next team up is going to be Seattle. Seattle only a couple games back despite injuries to Dick Hopkins. They added Jeremy Mitchell was a huge addition. He's having a great season for them. And frankly, this is a really solid roster. Bringing Rouse back was another great move. And GM Lil Dicky, he might be in the running for GM of the year here too. Great job all around. This is a deep team. They have the most depth that they've had during the Matt Pitts era. They have probably the best starting lineup they've had of the Matt Pitts era, at least since Arthur Peterson was there. So it's going to be interesting to see how the team does the rest of the way. And New Orleans is somehow in the playoffs. They should not be there. Ty Pancher is having a great season. That's about it. Ezekiel Bridges is okay, but this team is just overperforming expectations. A great season from Michael Scarn, who's nearly averaging a triple-double. Wow, that is insane. This team's got a real quick turnaround. I'm absolutely astounded. Yeah, G-Man might have won GM of the year in his rookie GMing season. He might be the best GM to ever run this team. And this team's had legendary GMs like myself, the real G Wood, and also Mo. This is just a great season for the G-Man. And then looking at the non-playoff teams in the West, you have Mexico, who's just unfortunately in such a deep conference. They kind of deserve to be in the playoffs, but they're in the last season of Randy King's contract, and he's probably going to demand much less money in the offseason. CJ Evans' contract's expiring, and this team's got a lot of flexibility in the offseason. With a fairly young roster, they'll still have Guzman coming back, so they do definitely have upside. But it's going to be interesting to see how expensive players like West Hunter price themselves out of this team's budget, but they could definitely be a contender next season. And Las Vegas, probably the biggest disappointment. Not going to lie. Noel coming back is helpful, and they probably will make the playoffs because of that. They'll probably be in the 7th or 8th seed. Owens is having an MVP season, and Jalen Okabe is a beast, but they really needed that point guard. The fact that they're getting him now is great, but might be too little too late for this season. Great GMing job to build this solid roster. Owens will probably lock in a massive contract. It's not like they failed to build around him, though, if they don't hit the playoffs, there's a chance he does demand a trade. It is possible, or sign elsewhere. So we'll have to see how and watch. That's going to be an interesting offseason story. The decision to speak, testing free agency, very possible. St. Louis, they're led by Tyrone Petrie, as I said. I think it would be excellent if Petrie could make his way to a team that had a little bit more roster around him. He averages 10 assists, is basically a lone star here. They have 2 other players that are currently on their roster that have averaged over 10 points. That basically tells you what you need to know. Ironically, they're both small forwards. Cortland Davis and Marcus Johnson both kind of having disappointing seasons, but Dominique King is an absolute beast off the bench for them. Long term, I'm not too concerned with this team. I actually think the Foster addition was a nice pickup. I think he'll play well for them if they decide not to move on from him or buy him out. Um, Foster, he might have bum knees now, but just 2 years ago, he was an absolute great two-way playmaker, and I see no reason why he can't be that for a contender if they decide to make the move for him. It's going to be interesting to see where he ends up. With 5 more teams left, we have San Francisco. Disappointment season, but what else is new for Lexcoat? I mean, Clippers are pretty disappointing over in, yes, shameless shout out to DBL. Um, and Mickey Collins has a really bright future. And the last few teams we'll get into here are Kansas City, which they're led by Steve Rice. They're going to get better. It just depends on how much better they're going to get with his addition. They might make a run at the end of the playoffs here, maybe potentially being the 8th seed come playoff time. Long term, though, Seth Ginn, Steve Rice for combined $55 million. Not a bad duo. If they can get somebody else to put alongside Tishman in the forward spots, this team could be a contender. They're just really lacking the depth. They could potentially make a play at Owens if he hits free agency. They have the cap flexibility at the end of the season, I believe, with a lot of contracts expiring off the bench. Yeah, they have $37 million Kevin Hart coming off that bench. So once that frees up, they'll have a lot of room to make a move towards a contender. We'll take a quick look at Anderson Duffy. Just disappointment here. I mean, they spent a ton of money bringing Kendall Wilcher, and he just hasn't really been the star that he was in Cleveland. I guess as Moto would say, he's a mercenary. He doesn't deserve my money. Quinn Hughes played a little bit off the bench, which is exciting. Gino, I know he's happy to have his own creative player. Bobby Gooden's having a great year off the bench, and Stonkus actually looks like he's showing signs of being a long-term quality starting two-way guard, which is great. If he can become a franchise point guard, this team has a bright future as long as they keep around Doug DeBerry, who could potentially decline to re-sign, but is more than likely staying put at least on a 2-year max deal, I can imagine. So then we'll look at San Diego. Bottom floor, as I said, they're rebuilding. Brent Jones is racking up those stats. Maybe he gets moved, maybe he doesn't. It's just a disappointing season for a team that added a lot of really good moves in the offseason. I mean, Joe Sally on paper was coming off of 2 really good years in which he hadn't really declined. Anderson as well. And just nobody worked out that they brought back. Even Udonis Felix just didn't really work out. And that's going to cause this team to have to really start a hard rebuild once again. It'll be interesting to see if they can get any value out of John Cameron. John Cameron was, you know, he was highly touted, never developed, just always stayed as a starting small forward, never became a borderline star that people thought he might be able to be, and as a result was highly overpaid, but he still got value, right? And the last team is Houston. The garbage. Well, sort of. They have a bunch of potential. Several 70 pluses on the roster, including Darko Andrazin. They're definitely becoming the more or less the Dallas Mavericks or the Memphis Grizzlies of the league with a lot of foreign talent, with Petrovic and Milicic. Um, Both of them look phenomenal and are young. You'll have 2 guys under 23, 2 years experience. It's going to be interesting to see. One thing I can say is Chris Matthews, he's going to want that paycheck, and I don't think he cares where he gets it from. He's a two-way starting big man. He's probably getting a max 7-year deal at this point or 6-year deal at this point. Um, so it's going to be interesting. We'll take a quick gander at league leaders, see if there's anything crazy. Halenga leading at points, no surprise there with Owens at number 2. Buckner putting up the big stats as well. And if you look at rebounds, of course, Ty Jackson and Rollerson basically in vacuums, where they're the only big man, putting up crazy stats. Shaheen in third, no surprise for him. Assists is once again led by Banks, which is tremendous. He's one of the best passers in league history. And that's basically what you can expect there. When it comes to blocks, it's good to see coronavirus way above everyone else in the league, which is just unprecedented. It's too bad that this man has literally no offense at just 5.7 points per game. But one of the most valuable contract year players. We'll take a look at some of those in a moment. Steals-wise, you also have Jake King having an unprecedented season. The two of them probably going to be in the running for Defensive Player of the Year. And ultimately, when it comes down to that, they both could be in for big roles. If you look at upcoming free agents this season, we'll see guys like Owens, Ty Jackson, A.O. McKinney, Marcus McPherson, Dedrick Vonville, Trustis, all potentially hitting free agency. There could be potentially an RNG event in which some of the top free agents automatically test free agency this year to try to form a super team. Be an interesting mechanic to throw in. So we'll see how that goes. All right, everyone. Thank you. And yeah.